Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining this Facebook Live broadcast this morning. I'm Allison Johnson from Windsor Regional Hospital, and today we're talking about the role of research in the fight against and the treatment of COVID-19. With our guests today, we have Dr. Lisa Porter. She is the Executive Director at the WeSpark Health Institute and a Professor of Biomedical Sciences at the University of Windsor. We have Dr. Wassim Saad, Chief of Staff here at Windsor Regional Hospital, and Muir, CEO of the Unemployed Help Centre in Windsor, one of the first people in our region diagnosed with COVID-19, and she brings the patient perspective to our conversation. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Allison.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And welcome to all of you who are joining this conversation. This is Coping with COVID, a series of live conversations about COVID-19. If you have any questions today for our panel of guests, this is your opportunity. Please submit them in the comment section below, and we will try to address them during today's discussion. And so I don't know about any of you, but it feels to me like ever since maybe February, I've had very few conversations that were not about this virus. But this is a conversation that I am actually looking forward to, because part of coping with this virus, which is what this webcast is about hope. And being able to see that there are better days ahead. And a big part of that has to do with the work that researchers are doing right now all around the world and right here in Windsor-Essex. So Dr. Porter, I want you to start off our conversation today, pick up on this, talk about the importance of research in our current situation, like right back to the beginning when we didn't know too much about it, to right now when we're looking at making important decisions about schools and borders and economies and waiting for that vaccine.
Exactly. So, I think one of the things about COVID is that the community has really been involved in a live science experiment. And, this happens in all different sort of diseases and things that we are dealing with every day, except unlike normal situations where research does its job and before the community actually hears about it. So we make sure that everything is approved. It goes through a long series of work and approval processes before it comes out to the communities. In the case of COVID, this was in people's face right away. And so people knew this was happening. It was a brand new virus. We knew nothing about this particular strain of virus. But one of the things we did know is that this is from a family of virus called the coronaviruses. And there was data back, from the SARS days and from some other strains of these viruses that could allow researchers to have a starting point. And so when those first very early recommendations came out, they came out based on what we knew about the science of those first viruses. But then the science community had to get to work, and we had to start figuring out exactly all the biology and all of the different things clinically that could go on with this individual strain. And that was brand new. And so the recommendations, when people are saying, we're so confused because the recommendations keep changing, they keep changing because the clinic is keeping up with the research. And that's so important. As new data comes out, the public health and the clinics are really keeping up, and they're changing. And we want to see that happening. They're not just saying, this is what we believed was going to happen, and we're staying the course to not confuse people. They're doing what's best for the community, and that's so important.
And it is frustrating when the answers aren't there immediately, and frustrating when they change over time, but understanding how we're coming to these answers, that's what we're talking about today. Dr. Saad, a question for you. I assume you've been doing quite a bit of reading lately, and I want to know, how do you stay on top of all of the latest information, given that it is changing so quickly, information on treatment and prevention and best practices in the hospital, so that when you're with patients like June, you have all the latest information to share?
You're absolutely right. The pace of change with the information that we have is we call it breakneck speeds. It's going that fast. When it comes to this type of disease, as Dr. Porter's mentioned, it's a new virus. We didn't know a lot about it, so we had to stay on top of the medical information and the literature as much as we possibly could. Unlike, tuberculosis or other infectious diseases, influenza that have been around for, decades or even 100 years, we know everything that they do, everything that they don't do, and we have a lot more information and knowledge about it. So when information changes this quickly, you really have to turn to reputable sources, medical journals, looking at the type of research that's being done, ensuring that it's quality research, because there's different types of research that people can do. And a lot of it, especially when it's a new virus or a new entity where you don't have a lot of information, sometimes people will fill in those gaps with non-science related information, and that can be very dangerous. But knowing that we have to treat patients in the hospital and give advice to the community on how to prevent transmission of the virus, and staying up to date with the latest and greatest when it comes to treatments, because we have patients in the hospital, patients on ventilators, you rely a lot on the scientific information and the literature, but also on what experiences are happening in other centers in the world. We had the advantage in Canada where, we saw the rise of cases in Europe and then in the US. And of course, it started in China before that. And so in the scientific community, physicians and scientists would talk to their colleagues across the pond, across the river, across the ocean, to see what were their experiences, what did you do that worked. And then sometimes you could try things anecdotally, but really that's not how your research really happens. You really want to make sure that it's robust research with many patients, lots of controls in place before you can implement it on a widespread scale.
And we're going to talk about some of that research, some of the most important research happening, including right here. But June, first I have a question for you. You had the virus early on. In fact, you're the reason why we're doing this program, because you mentioned that at the time you had so many questions about what was happening to you and why it was happening, but those answers weren't readily available. So what was that experience like? And then where did you go to get your information when you're trying to make important decisions, right, about your treatment and recovery?
So Allison, it was really frustrating. It was discouraging. It was challenging. It caused a lot of anxiety because I could not find the answers to my questions. So I actually went to CNN and watched Chris Como on prime time. He had the virus at the time and he was able to share what he was going through. I also tried to go on the internet and look for information, but there really was no information there for me. I had a public health nurse checking in. She was supportive, but still was not getting the answers that I needed. I'll give you an example. I was trying to find out when it would be time for me to come back to work, and I was getting tested, and some tests would come back negative. I'd get a positive and inconclusive, and I didn't know why. And I was really trying to find out why and when was it a good time for me to return. And I was having night sweats and I was having heart palpitations, and I didn't realize that I would be a long hauler at that time. But I finally was in touch with a doctor that cleared me and gave me great advice, and that was really hopeful.
And I do want to remind everyone that during our discussion today, if you have any questions for June or Dr. Porter or Dr. Saad, please post them and we will try and address them in our show. I do want to turn now to local research. What is going on locally? And a question sent by email from Karen. She wants to know, why is it important to have COVID research happening in our community? And Lisa, Dr. Porter, I will throw that question over to you.
Yeah, so I love that question, and I think it's so important. I mean, one of the things that we know is that when you're answering a research question, you're doing that work right here. So it's involving our patient population. It's bringing the latest cutting edge drugs, equipment, everything right here to our community. So our patients are getting access to that care immediately. That's why it's important not just to happen and wait for it to trickle down to our center. We have to have research happening here. It's just, without a doubt, it's so important.
And I want to introduce everyone right now to one local researcher. Dr. Carolyn Ham is a medical oncologist here at Windsor Regional Hospital, and she's the chair of the hospital's academic and research committee. And in this video, she takes us into the lab to talk about the convalescent plasma trial that Windsor Regional is participating in.
What it is we're taking the serum from men that have had COVID in the past, and we're taking out the red cells and all the particles of the blood and just taking the serum. What will be left is a fluid with antibodies in it, and those antibodies will be infused into the patient, and they will help the patient fight COVID. We use this already in patients that have other viruses, and we know that that's successful. And we're very excited to offer this to our patients here in Windsor.
So these are the screenshots of what the LIS actually looks like when we actually put them in. We're going to put a code right on the patient. That
So how it works is a patient will come into hospital. If they need oxygen and if they're not intubated, they may be eligible for this trial. So we have an entire team working at both sites, both MET and OLET, screening every day for patients that might be eligible for this trial. As soon as a patient is considered to be eligible, they have a 2 out of 3 chance of getting the actual serum that has already been collected and is being stored right here in Windsor waiting for them.
And this is what happens if they try to give it to somebody who's not supposed to get it. They get this sign that says, no, too bad for you. You can't give it.
Hi, I'm Nicole Polluti. I'm the lead tech in the blood bank here at MET. And my role in this study is to store, thaw, and have the plasma issued to patients who are actually enrolled in the study. So we're keeping the plasma here in the blood bank. It's stored in the freezer here behind me. It's negative 30 degrees Celsius, so it's nice and cold. And the convalescent plasma has its own shelf specifically for it, so it can't get confused with any of the other plasma that we have in here. These packages are from patients who have recovered from COVID, and their antibody count level that was checked is high enough to actually, hopefully, be able to help patients who have it now.
We have strong indication that it's going to help people, but until you do the trial, you don't know for sure. And that's what we're trying to find out. We're hoping to avoid intubation. We're helping them to live and to go home healthy. Like any clinical trial, it takes a long time to get up and running. And this clinical trial went really at COVID speed. It went so quickly. It took us only 2.5 months to open up.
Oh, this is pretty exciting. This was kind of neat to be able to actually do something for people. Down here in the lab, we don't have the hands-on with these patients, right? We don't see what they're going through. We kind of hide out down here in the lab and help from behind. So it feels like we're doing something. It feels like we're actually becoming part of hopefully a solution for this.
And to be able to offer somebody a potential cure it's as good as giving curative chemotherapy. I've talked to doctors who have patients that have COVID, and just how heartbreaking it is to watch these patients get sicker and sicker without any effective treatment. So, this is hope. This is hope that we can save lives.
And that was recorded back in June. At the time, we were maybe 3 months into this new normal, still getting used to the isolation. And that was the first time in a long time that I had seen someone smile that big. So Dr. Ham just made my day. She made me realize that, things will be okay because we have smart and passionate people like Dr. Ham and Nicole Polluti, who you just saw there, and they're working in labs all over the world looking at this virus from so many different angles. It may take some time, but we can do this. So Dr. Saad, to you, that was back in June. What do we know about where things are at with that trial now?
So that is one of about 12 trials we have ongoing at Windsor Regional Hospital. If there's one thing good that could come of this pandemic, it's how quickly it pushed and advanced the academic and research vision of the hospital. I wanted to make sure that we were on the leading edge and at the forefront of clinical research that was being done. I wanted to make sure that Windsor Regional Hospital participated in any research that was being done, whether that's national, multinational. And the Concord trial, which Dr. Ham was just talking about, was one of the original treatment trials, the convalescent serum trial. There was another one called the ACT trial, which also studied antibodies in patients who had recovered to see if it would be beneficial. And Windsor Regional Hospital was actually one of the first hospitals. In fact, we enrolled the very first patient in Canada into that trial. And those trials have been ongoing. Obviously, there was a bit of a lull in the summer when we didn't have as many inpatient COVID patients. But unfortunately, now that we're heading into wave 2, we're starting to see more patients. So those trials have not yet closed, and we're continuing to enroll patients in those trials. Those are the 2 treatment trials that we have ongoing. We have several testing trials ongoing at the hospital, looking at the effectiveness of tests. We have antibody testing trials to look at what the prevalence might be in the community in terms of people who may have acquired the virus and didn't even know they had it. And then we have other trials and studies going on to look at the effects COVID has had on patients, including their mental health, their well-being, and also trying to create a registry, which is our most recent study right now, looking at long haulers, people who've had COVID, what are their symptoms, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year out, and then obviously that'll be ongoing and looking into the future because we just haven't had enough time with this virus.
And I know that research about long haulers will be of interest to June. We'll get into that a bit more in a minute, but Dr. Porter, I want to ask you, Dr. Ham used the term COVID speed. Mm-hmm. What kind of pressure is there on researchers to move quickly? Because we all want answers. We all want to get a vaccine. We all want to get a treatment. Does that kind of need for speed, does it put pressure on the researchers, and does it affect the accuracy of the information?
So I think for researchers, this has been almost a breath of fresh air. Like for researchers, often there is a lot of silos, a lot of red tape to move research forward. And one of the biggest things that we can do to move research forward is to work effectively together. Right before COVID came within Windsor-Essex, we launched the We Spark Health Institute, which for me obviously was hugely exciting. But it was also novel in that our two hospitals, Hotel de Grace Healthcare, Windsor Regional, working together with the university and the college, quite revolutionary and very forward thinking for our city. And I think that has really allowed us to all work together to take, Dr. Saad just mentioned the mental health resources. So to take some of the strengths from Hotel de Grace and to bring that together with Windsor Regional and see the kind of awesome kind of questions that they can ask together. We've seen this within our city, people coming together, taking researchers to work together provincial, on a national, and on an international scale. We've seen, unlike any other time before, people taking down barriers, working together. One of the reasons why things are moving so fast is because money was mobilized for research. Funding for research is always a difficult thing. You have to go through many, many steps to get an idea funded. It takes many years sometimes to get one idea funded. In this case, people's ideas were funded, right? Money was opened up. People said, let's fund this research. We need to find ideas. They forced people to work together. They said, we're not going to restrict how journals are publishing that data. We're going to take down, and we call it open access. So all COVID research was made open access. This allowed researchers to share their ideas. They set up common platforms where we could share data. This took money, it took vision, it took work, but people pulled together and did the hard tasks that needed to be done. And so I think, researchers always work fast. It's what we want to do. We wake up in the morning, jump out of bed. We want to move our passions forward. And the last thing you want to do is to have to rip through red tape. And so really what we saw with COVID was people had a tremendous willingness. The government rallied, people rallied to say, let's find solutions. And that's why things are moving quickly.
So really seizing the opportunity there, and so important that it does move quickly right now. A question now for June, and this is from Nicole Ver. Not necessarily research related, but I think it does get us into that conversation about research and long haulers. And Nicole wants to know, June, are you symptom free now, or do you find that you're not back to normal?
No, I'm not back to normal. I still have heart palpitations. I still have hair loss. I still can't taste sometimes. If I drink some teas, I'm not able to taste them. And so there still are a lot of things that I'm experiencing. And I just hope that I will get news one day that this won't last forever.
In terms of the opportunity to ask questions, like you said, there wasn't the information, and you're kind of like my co-host here today. So are there any questions that you would like to ask to Dr. Saad and Dr. Porter while they're here?
Yes. So I'm wondering, will I ever have the opportunity to get an antibody test? I'm curious to see if I have any antibodies and what that would mean. And as a long hauler, will I ever overcome some of the symptoms, will those symptoms go away? Will I ever be me again, I guess, is my question. And I know those are hard questions to answer, but, you know, just being a long hauler and having this virus in March and still dealing with it today has been very difficult. And as Dr. Saad said, emotionally and mentally, it does, you know, impact how you're feeling. So today has brought a lot of hope and has made me feel a lot better hearing about what's going on. And I look forward to hearing the answers to my questions.
I'm happy to take the antibody question because we do have an antibody test that is available. It's not yet approved by Health Canada. It has been approved in the US, and we're expecting approval within the next week or two. And that will allow people to get a test done and then tell them whether they have the antibodies or not. But we also have to, you know, be careful with that information because you may have had COVID, June, and you know you were confirmed to have had COVID earlier, but your antibodies may not have lasted in your system. So if I tested you now for the antibodies and you were negative, that wouldn't really tell you anything more than what you already knew, which is that you were positive at the time. It may become useful later on to say, oh, you know what, you have antibodies, and that may offer protection against the subsequent infection. And then you know, it could last months and years, and we don't really know how long those what we call native antibodies last. Similar to vaccines. When the vaccine comes out, people will be vaccinated. One way to check if a vaccine has been effective is to do antibody testing later on. We do this for other infectious diseases. And again, because it's so new, we don't know how long that immunity is going to last. When it comes to your long haul symptoms, you're right. There are no answers right now, no definitive answers. But if I can offer you some hope, I have had a couple of patients who I've been following who have had long haul symptoms. One was admitted to our ICU back in I believe it was May, and their symptoms are slowly waning away and are nearly back to normal. And they just did a follow-up last week, and the patient said they were at about 95% back to normal. So that's good news. That's hope. You know, as long as, and I always tell patients, as long as you feel like this week is better than the week before, which was better than the week before that, that's usually a good sign that the trajectory is heading towards complete recovery. But if you notice that it's the same this week as it was last week, as it was last month, and you've stalled, you know, that could be a different scenario. But for the most part, we're seeing slow recovery.
Thank you.
Dr. Porter, is there any local research being done on that, the long haulers?
So there are some studies that have been put up for funding that are looking specifically at the long haulers. We know that there's data collection beginning. One of the things, you know, sort of to the points that Dr. Saad mentioned is, you know, for long haulers, just as the name implies, it requires long-term collection of data and the analysis of that data before we can have concrete answers. So definitely people are putting in the work. It's a priority for all of us. I think another big thing with that point that I mentioned before about people sharing information, this is what allows that kind of information to be gathered quicker. So we're not just relying on our long hauler data locally, but able to communicate and bring in data from all over the world. And also, you know, for medical sciences, one of the big things that we've recognized for a really long time is that, you know, different people, our biology, our genetics makes us all different. And so having access to people of different ethnicities, different sex and genders, things that are different about all of us, it's going to be so important in us getting really concrete answers to your questions. And I think we're going to get them much quicker in the COVID area than we have in other diseases.
Good news. And another question on the same line from Anna Bennett-Gerard. She wants to know if there's been any research done to know a percentage or how many of the people who contracted this virus are actually experiencing symptoms down the road, are long haulers. Do we know anything about that?
So that goes back to the registry that I was mentioning, where we are planning to contact every single positive patient in Windsor-Essex from the beginning of the pandemic, and then following up with them to say, have you recovered completely? Are you 100%? Do you have long haul symptoms? And how long did it take you to recover? And so when we get that information, then we'll be able to publish some data to answer that exact question. But we don't have the answer yet, but we are definitely looking at it.
Okay. Go now to a question from Facebook. Are any of the researchers considering or open to collaboration with other scientists or PhD students to obtain data internationally about COVID-19? Dr. Porter, I'll let you take that one. I know that there's a lot of collaboration happening.
Yeah, certainly. So for all researchers, with regards to our local researchers, we invite them to go to the WeSpark website, and you can actually even fill out, there's a form where you can ask us what kind of questions, what kind of research study you're interested in. And we can set you up with individuals that are interested in those exact research questions. You can also attend our think tanks, which are offered every second month, and you can hear about some of the questions that are ongoing locally and participate in those discussions. Certainly, we're always happy to have collaborators around the world.
And if anybody's interested, we have posted those links below in the comment section. And I know I can see from the comment section here, even right now, we have somebody watching, Nisoni, watching from Zambia, a PhD applicant, and he's in biological sciences. He says, thank you for broadcasting. Thank you for joining us today. A question now from Sam Marlowe, who asks, how is it possible to have the virus and not know it? So do we have any research on the asymptomatic population? Dr. Saad, do you want to start that one?
Sure, yeah. And this goes back to a comment Dr. Porter made about all of us being different. We're all genetically made different. There are no two people that are alike. And in some people, the virus will infect them. They will have absolutely no symptoms, but then they will be able to transmit it to other people. And then in some patients, for whatever reason, and we have some idea of what risk factors might be involved, they end up on a ventilator and require high levels of oxygen, and some even die from it. So we don't know exactly, we know the risk factors for those patients that are likely to end up on a ventilator. These are patients who usually don't have good access to medical care. They have other comorbidities such as obesity, high blood pressure, heart disease, underlying lung disease. So any other comorbidities increases your risk. We know the elderly, so age in and of itself sometimes puts you at risk for worse disease. We know that about 40% of mortality overall was in patients in long-term care facilities who are generally older and have other comorbidities. So we don't know the exact answer of why some people don't get it, other than to say that this virus affects everybody differently. We're all genetically different, and you really don't know whether you're going to have minimal symptoms or no symptoms, whether you're just going to lose your sense of taste and smell, or unfortunately, if you end up on a ventilator and require ICU care.
Dr. Porter, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things also is that, you know, as I think people have heard in the literature or in the news, is that for asymptomatic people, you know, one of the big things is obviously that you can still be infectious. So it's important for people to know that, you know, that's the biggest thing about this virus is you can have it and not know it. And so that is a super dangerous situation. It can sit also for a very long time before, or longer than many types of viruses before you even are detected as positive. And so one of the things that research has really spent a long time doing is figuring out the best kind of screening technologies that we can use. There are a variety of different kinds of tests available. So nucleic acid testing is one where it's the one you go in and get the nasal swab, and then it goes off for what we call PCR analysis. And even here locally, we've developed a rapid PCR test that can do that process using a buccal swab, which means it's just for your cheek. But with research, the data that we're collecting, we know that the amount of virus that was collected from your cheek is not as high as the one that's able to be collected in your nose. So there's pluses and minuses. Obviously, we could do that much easier, much quicker, but it has to be done more often. So, you know, the things that people are hearing, and I know so frustrating for people to hear about things on for coming from the public health where directions are changing. But the advice that they're giving is based in science. It's based on what we know, and it's so important to follow.
Absolutely. Now, I would say arguably some of the most important, definitely the most watched research right now is around the vaccine. Dr. Saad, what's the latest on where we're at with that research?
So, a lot of money has been poured into vaccine research, and I think a lot of us in the medical and scientific community, I would say, are surprised that we actually have a vaccine that's come to the market within a calendar year of the endeavor starting. There are two right now, one from Pfizer and one from Moderna, that are seeking FDA approval for emergency access use. The news from this morning is that the UK just approved the Pfizer vaccine for use in the United Kingdom, and we're expecting Health Canada to do the same for both Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine sometime in early January. So if things roll out the way they're supposed to, the FDA is supposed to approve it in the US, or is likely to approve it in mid-December for one, and then a week later for the Moderna one. And then by the end of the year, there will be mass vaccinations that will likely start. In Canada, we know that we've tried to secure, the government has secured, multiple doses from 8 of the companies that are engaged in vaccine development right now. So we'll have those 2 vaccines hopefully available to us in early January or mid-January. Now, having said that, we know vaccines don't necessarily save lives and stop pandemics. It's vaccination programs. So it's one thing to have it. It's another thing to make sure that it's rolled out and that enough people are vaccinated to develop herd immunity and to protect the community and the public. And of course, there are a lot of unknowns. This research was fast-tracked quite a bit. We don't know everything in terms of side effects, potential side effects, and we certainly don't know what long-term side effects could be. But there are going to be obviously ways to track any potential side effects after the vaccines are rolled out to the public. So that's where we are right now with vaccine development.
And we talk about how quickly this is moving, Operation Warp Speed, of course. What are the risks involved, even from a perception of the safety of the drug when we're moving this quickly, likely record-breaking toward a vaccine? Dr. Porter?
I think it's really important for people to understand about vaccination and how it works. I think there's so much misinformation out there about vaccination. I hear some things about, we should just let our immune system handle this. Vaccination is letting your immune system handle the virus. It's basically, and this one's a very cool vaccine in that for a molecular biologist, it actually uses what we call RNA. And this virus is an RNA virus. So they put in just a teeny little bit of basically the code from this virus, and it allows your body to make a little bit of protein that then is going to trick your immune system into thinking you have the virus. But it's going to just do it enough that it mounts a response. And so one of the reasons why people said, I saw something on Facebook saying people were reported to feeling hungover or, feeling sick. Yeah, that can happen because when you get vaccinated, your immune system is working. So it's setting up immunity so that if you are exposed to the true virus that's going to integrate to your DNA and cause those long-term effects, you will already have the immune response. So it's going to be able to battle. And when people say this is new, it is a new vaccine. However, it's founded on decades of information about how vaccines work. And so we're not starting at completely square one with this. And so we do understand a lot about, how to deliver the vaccine, how to deliver vaccine programs, the effects and what to monitor for. So I think it's founded in a lot of knowledge, a lot of history. And again, a lot of the reasons why it's moving forward so quickly is because of the mobilization of resources and support to get it out there.
And a lot of communication going to take place, I'm sure, before we start that process. A question from Mike Eldon. We were talking before about testing and the value there, and he wants to know then, why aren't we doing more testing? Dr. Saad?
That's an excellent question, and that's a question that everyone at the hospital has been asking since the beginning of the pandemic. Of course, at the beginning, the problem was we didn't have enough test kits. It's a new virus. You need specific types of reagents. You need someone in the lab and the technology to be able to analyze it. Then when we started to have enough, then the labs were overwhelmed with the volume. And so then it created a delay of 1 to 2 weeks to get the results back. Now we have the capacity, but as we go into wave 2, we're starting to see a lot more tests. And really the only thing that's restricting our ability to test has been from the ministry. It's not access. Like we are given so many test results. We're told in the assessment center that you now have to do by appointment only, so that you can only schedule so many appointments in a day. And yes, of course, I would love to have more widespread testing. It's just not available, and right now it's mostly restricted by the ministry, and part of that might be cost, and I don't know the exact reasons, but I completely agree. I think we absolutely need to have more testing, because if you don't test, you won't know what you're dealing with specifically, and that applies to outbreaks as well. So you're dealing with an outbreak, you don't know how widespread the extent of the outbreak is. You need to be able to test everyone to know where you're at that point, and then do point prevalence testing, meaning do it again in a week or do it again, in a few days, to know if that first set of tests gave you some false negatives and that people might still have been positive. So yes, I'm all for more testing. The more, the better. It gives you a lot of information, but we've been restricted mostly because of testing availability.
And I can add if you want. Another thing is that locally, even we've been looking at, and Dr. Saad mentioned, I think everybody's been bombarded with different companies doing different kinds of tests, etc. We've been working on testing in the research setting, a variety of different kinds of tests. One of the research studies that was done in collaboration with Windsor Regional was comparing the public health nasal swab testing with these buccal sort of rapid tests, and determining, can we get costing down? It is a big factor. If you want to repeat test so that you're able to ensure that you're minimizing false positives and negatives, you have to do repeated testing, which can be very, very costly. And so one of the things, that we really were looking at setting up some test cohorts to look at population-based testing, and seeing whether we can gather tests together. So it would be called, we're gathering cohorts into one test and determining if there's any positives within that one test, and can we get down dollars so that we can repeat test. And just one other exciting kind of study that's happening locally is with environmental monitoring. And so this is done with the Great Lakes Environmental Institute, CLEAR, and some leaders there, and in collaboration with our entire city, where they've been testing the wastewater. And this is actually a provincial and I believe now national effort, where we can get a lot of surveillance of our wastewater, and they're trying to pare it down where we could locate buildings that have positive cases, which then might allow us to say, okay, this building has some positive cases, so now let's do screening on this building. So can we take it sort of at a really big environmental level and then scale it and do some sort of quicker, more rapid screens, and then send cohorts to the hospital for those more precise nasal screens, that also helps to preserve the resources that we have at public health and our hospital.
That is really cool and really important stuff happening here in Windsor-Essex. So I want to highlight another local research project right now and introduce you to Dr. Jen Voth. She's a researcher at Hotel Dieu Grace Healthcare, and she is looking at the psychological impact that this pandemic is having on healthcare workers in this region.
People share their experiences in working through the pandemic, their levels of psychological distress, what are their biggest concerns, kind of their main fears, what types of strategies they've used to reduce their stress, and any recommendations that they have for their organization to help best support them through the pandemic. What we found from the first wave and what we're finding now, I'll just say that 403 healthcare workers completed our survey in wave 1. And we've got almost about, I think, 150 healthcare workers completing wave 2. And what we're finding for both waves is a significant amount of psychological distress. For wave 1, we found that 70% of our sample were reporting experiencing high levels of psychological distress. And for wave 2, I think it's over 83% are experiencing high levels of psychological distress. So what that means are symptoms like restlessness, fatigue, trouble sleeping, depressed mood, anxiety, which are normal emotional responses to a pandemic. I think many of us are experiencing more than our usual amount of anxiety or stress at this time. But despite their fears, being afraid, being at high risk of exposure, healthcare workers are showing up to work. They're choosing on behalf of the most vulnerable in our community every day, over and over. But what we know from past research is that this high level of stress takes a toll in the long run. It can result in burnout and absenteeism and just extreme exhaustion. And when that happens, it can negatively impact patient care, and it can impact the ability of teams and organizations and the health system on a whole to meet the needs of our patients. I think what's really critical to being able to develop effective supports and resources for healthcare workers is just first understanding what their experiences have been and what's really driving that anxiety and fear, so that organizations and leadership can focus on addressing those specific concerns. What most concerns me is that these high levels of distress really do take that toll in the long term on those who are on the front lines and who are working long hours and who are working in challenging work environments. And I think that puts them at risk for long-term physical and mental health issues.
That study is still ongoing, but Dr. Saad, I wanted to ask you, in terms of decision making, how does having this information help with an organization like Windsor Regional Hospital with 4,000 employees?
Sorry, Allison, I didn't hear you. You were muted for a second.
I want to know, even though that study hasn't concluded yet, there are some initial results there, and how does having that kind of information help organizations like Windsor Regional Hospital and other healthcare providers make decisions that affect staffing and the organization?
As with most research, if you don't do it, you don't know what the answer to your question is. And for that study in particular, they were looking at what some of the mental health impacts were on healthcare workers. And yes, there's anecdotal information that you can get. I'm stressed, you're stressed, I'm handling it okay. But until you actually look at the information, you don't realize how staggering the numbers are. 70% in wave 1, 83% in wave 2. You're talking about nearly everybody who was involved having a significant amount of stress or strain on them. So then you take that information, you say, okay, you know what? Maybe we're not hearing the full extent of it in our organization. Maybe it is a bit more pervasive than we think. Maybe we should do some outreach to people who are working here and say, hey, listen, be proactive as opposed to sit back and wait for them to come to you, because they may not come to you. So we've made resources available to everyone that's working at the hospital in terms of accessing resources that they need for improvement of their mental health, ensuring that they get breaks when they need to, not putting people, we used to, in the first part of the pandemic when we thought everybody was handling it okay, having what we called hot zones and cold zones. And staff were hot staff versus cold staff or warm staff. But then you realize that if you're always on a unit with positive patients, it may seem that you're handling it okay, but day after day after day, that can start to affect you. And when you get information from research like this that says, you know what, maybe they're not doing okay, then you start to rotate and you say, you know what, we're going to accept a slightly higher risk of potential transmission to be able to protect the mental health of the people who work and care for these patients. And maybe you'll do 1 week in the hot zone, 1 week in the warm zone, 1 week in the cold zone, and then we'll rotate. So we do use that information to try to help mitigate, risk and also try to protect the mental health of everyone that's looking after them. Because without those frontline workers, we don't have a hospital and we can't look after those patients.
So important research there and an important topic. And I do want to mention that one of the future topics we'll cover on here is coping with COVID from a healthcare perspective, because like that research shows, that is a big issue right now. Back to Facebook, we have a question from Rasha who says, I'm at home with COVID right now. I'm wondering whether the intensity of the symptoms have anything to do with how long I will be dealing with this. My symptoms are mild to moderate. So is there any research linking how you're feeling right now to how you will recover? Dr. Porter?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think for the long-term effects, we are going to have to wait for the long-term data to come in to conclusively have an answer to that. There were some studies that demonstrated a correlation between symptoms and some of the longevity of effects. Initially, there's a study. It's about this, a molecular biology level. We call it a cytokine storm. So these are some molecules in your body that just kind of go crazy. And so, like Dr. Saad mentioned earlier, we don't understand yet why this happens in some people and not in others. But definitely, I think that sort of adverse response indicates, that there's something with some individuals that are having a worse response. But again, I think the data is still coming in, and we're trying to, evaluate in live time. Maybe Dr. Saad can add to that answer.
Yeah, no, I agree. Although there is some evidence that the milder your symptoms are, the more likely you are to recover quickly. That doesn't apply to everybody because, again, everybody's different. We found this also in the first wave of the pandemic, and even now, where we were doing testing. And June could speak to this, but you test positive, you have symptoms, then you feel better and you feel great and you want to go back to work, and you get tested again and you're positive again, and you keep testing positive, and then sometimes you'll get a negative after 5 positives, and then another positive after that. Like there's a lot of information out there, and we don't fully understand it. But as a general rule, the milder your symptoms are, the shorter the duration overall, but that does not necessarily apply across the board.
And June, maybe you can pick up on this, because I know that you and your husband both experienced this, but both had different outcomes. Did you find that the severity of the symptoms had anything to do with the recovery?
So my husband was sicker than I was, and he seems to have no symptoms today. I was not as sick as him, and yet I'm the long hauler. So it is really interesting, and I didn't expect to continue to have symptoms. So as Dr. Porter and Dr. Saad said, it's just so unknown, right? Nobody knows.
And I think that that's part of the value in what we're doing here, right? Because while that research is still being done, June, thank you for sharing your story so that people at home, kind of know they're not going through it alone, just as you went through it, right, with Mr. Cuomo on CNN. I think that it may be time to start wrapping things up, but I do have a final question for Dr. Porter and Dr. Saad, to each of you. Kind of as we approach the winter and with the lockdown looming, and all this talk of advancement does offer hope. So I want to ask each of you, what have you read lately, or what studies have you come across that give you the most hope? And Dr. Porter, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it is the point that these large groups working together. So, consortiums that are coming together to share data and to tear down those barriers so that we can move things forward more rapidly. For me, I think an exciting area that has really moved forward rapidly with COVID is with screening and the kinds of platforms that are being used. And so there's research right now being done, and we do have one individual, Dr. Simon Rondo, locally. This is a really hot new recruit in the science world to Windsor. He was ranked one of the top chemists in Canada, and he's here in Windsor. And one of the things that he's looking at is creating kind of lab on a chip kind of technology that could really allow for rapid analysis. And this would be doing, looking at the detection of the virus. So people like June maybe could do it right there in their home and continue to monitor eventually. And so I think some of the technology that's coming out is going to be long lasting, and it's going to also impact other areas, testing for a lot of other kinds of infectious diseases down the road. So I think it's an exciting time. Well, it's scary, and we're still learning a lot. But I think from a science lens, it really is just a new world in how people are communicating and things are moving.
And how exciting is it that we have one of the top chemists, or did you say the top chemist in the country?
We have a few actually. Our new recruits to Windsor, not even just in chemistry. Even at the clinic, we have some fabulous new people here with research dreams and looking to launch their research programs. I can say that since I started here, I think this is we're seeing research ramp up in Windsor-Essex like I've never seen.
And Dr. Saad, I know I've heard you talk about this in the past, that one of the benefits to having this kind of local research community really is in terms of recruitment. So that seems like very positive news there. Your final thoughts on what gives you the most hope in everything that you've read or talked about lately?
I think right now it's when at the start of this pandemic, we did our best to flatten the curve, and that was so we can buy time to either develop therapeutics for the virus or vaccinate people to be able to develop herd immunity. The therapeutic avenue really hasn't panned out that much. We have a couple of drugs like remdesivir, corticosteroids in the ICU, as well as the convalescent serum and the antibodies, which are showing some promise, but again, not great to the point where you can feel comfortable enough to go out and get it and think that you're going to be cured from it 100%. For me, the biggest promise is the vaccine. I do think that if these vaccines are effective enough and they're distributed widely enough, that we are going to get to some sense of normal sometime in hopefully the early or mid part of 2021. What Dr. Porter was talking about, I think, is also very important. Having that point of care testing where you could tell whether you have the virus or whether you have the antibody within a matter of minutes, will give people the freedom to go out wherever they want. I can anticipate scenarios where there's reservations at a restaurant and you have to prove that you're negative before you go in, or before booking a flight, or before going to a sporting event. So that, I think that part is very promising. But, for us to look at the real end of the pandemic, I think we're probably looking at mass vaccination programs, ensuring we develop herd immunity, and then the numbers will start to go down. The replication rate of the virus will decrease and hopefully go away. Although, of course, with viruses, you never know. It could become part of the repertoire of human infection in the future. But to me, the vaccine is the most promising thing.
So a lot to look forward to as we head toward the end of this year that has been a pretty long year for everybody. Really appreciate everyone being here today and sharing this perspective. Dr. Porter, Dr. Saad, June, thank you. And thanks to all of you who are tuning in today. We're going to continue this important conversation, coping with COVID, in the new year. We will be back in January with new topics to discuss, new guests, and continue watching as the situation evolves. You can watch our social media sites and our website for more information and details on that. And in the meantime, as we work our way through the second wave and head into the holidays, I want to wish all of you the very best. Please stay safe, please wear a mask, please keep your distance, and please listen to public health officials. Not going to be the easiest holiday, but hopefully we can all stay safe and meet back here next year and continue this conversation. Take care, everyone. Cheers.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Everyone, bye.